On a crisp spring morning, the kind where the air bites at your skin, yet still carries the promise of warmth, 72-year-old Clara Williams, a black woman battling Addison's disease, stepped into a high-end cafe nestled in the heart of downtown Boston. The city was busy, the streets crowded with people heading to meetings or catching cabs, but inside the cafe, it was a peaceful oasis. The sleek interior, with its polished wooden tables, soft ambient lighting, and the gentle hum of low conversations, created a serene atmosphere. Clara, wrapped in a cozy scarf and a soft wool coat, could feel the warmth embrace her the moment she crossed the threshold. Her body ached from the chill, and the stress of the past week weighed on her shoulders. The cold had aggravated her condition, and today she was feeling especially drained. She needed a quiet moment, a place to relax and gather her strength before heading back into the busy world outside. She spotted a small booth in the back corner, tucked away from the more crowded sections of the cafe, and made her way over. It was perfect, a spot where she could sit and rest her weary body without distraction. Clara settled in, taking a deep breath and closing her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the cafe seep into her bones. She placed her purse on the seat next to her and pulled out her medication. It was an essential part of her routine, one she couldn't afford to skip. She was used to the ritual, taking her pills with hot water and a light pastry to settle her stomach. The cafe, though busy, had a quiet energy to it that Clara found soothing. The noise from the city outside faded as she exhaled and focused on her task. She carefully poured the hot water from the small teapot into her cup, at the steam rising to her face, carrying with it a gentle scent of jasmine. As she took her first sip, Clara felt the tension in her shoulders begin to release. The pastry, a small fruit tart, was a welcome treat, simple but comforting. She allowed herself this small indulgence, grateful for this brief moment of peace. With each bite, she felt herself becoming more grounded, more at ease. For Clara, life had always been about balancing the demands of her health with the realities of living in a world that often wasn't kind to people like her. But today, in this cafe, she felt for once that she could set those worries aside. She could enjoy the quiet and forget, just for a little while, the struggles that often defined her existence. Clara had only begun to relax when the moment of tranquility was abruptly interrupted. A man, tall and lean, with sharp features and an air of condescension, approached her table. His uniform, black and crisp, with the cafe's logo embroidered on the breast, told Clara immediately that he was the manager. His name was Nathaniel Brooks, and there was something about him that immediately made her uneasy. "Excuse me, ma'am," Nathaniel said, his voice cold and dismissive. "I couldn't help but notice. What exactly are you doing here?" Clara's hand froze midair, the teacup just shy of her lips. She blinked, trying to process what he had just said. Surely, it was a misunderstanding. She was a paying customer, just like everyone else in the cafe. But Nathaniel's eyes scanned her from head to toe, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. It was as if he didn't expect her to be in a place like this. "I'm just having a moment to myself." Clara replied, trying to keep her voice even, to hide the irritation that bubbled up inside her. She straightened her posture, pushing the discomfort aside. Nathaniel murmured, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Well, I'll be honest, you don't quite fit the usual crowd here. This place is for people who appreciate finer things." Clara's heart sank as the implication hit her. He was judging her based on her appearance, on her age, and yes, on her skin color. She'd encountered prejudice before, but something about his tone, the way he said it so openly, felt like a slap in the face. "Excuse me?" Clara said, now feeling the sting of his words. "I don't see how my being here affects anyone else. I'm just enjoying my tea." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, unfazed by her resistance. "It's not just the tea. It's the special requests," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "A warm towel, a simple pastry. What next? Asking for the royal treatment?" His words were sharp, meant to belittle her. Clara's face tightened, but she refused to let him see how deeply he had hurt her. She had seen this kind of condescension before, people who thought that their wealth, their status, gave them the right to dictate who belonged and who didn't. She wasn't going to let him win. "I'm just here like anyone else," Clara said, her voice steady. "I don't need to explain myself to you." But Nathaniel wasn't finished. His expression shifted, becoming more hostile, more openly scornful. You don't belong here. You're just taking up space. Maybe it's bad luck that you're sitting in my cafe today. The sting of his words was sharper now, but Clara refused to let him see her falter. She had been through too much to let someone like him tear her down. She took a deep breath, lifting her chin and meeting his gaze. I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else, she said firmly, and I have every right to be here. Nathaniel scoffed, his eyes narrowing. You're just causing trouble, he sneered, his tone venomous. Probably a drug addict, too. People like you always come in here causing problems. Clara felt the weight of his words like a blow to her chest. But she wasn't about to let him see the hurt. She clenched her fists under the table, reminding herself that this moment would pass. He didn't define her. With all the strength she could muster, Clara stood her ground. I have the right to be here. I'm not going anywhere. But even as she said the words, Clara could feel the room closing in around her. Nathaniel wasn't finished. He was going to push her until something broke. Clara's heart raced, but her resolve remained firm. She could feel Nathaniel's eyes boring into her, but she refused to cower. She took a deep breath and glanced around the cafe. Most of the other patrons had either turned their attention to their own business or were pretending not to notice the confrontation. Clara knew that if she didn't stand up for herself now, no one else would. I'd like to speak with the manager, she said, her voice steady, despite the turmoil brewing inside her. Nathaniel's lips curled into a mock smile, and he took a step back, crossing his arms over his chest. I am the manager, ma'am, he said with an air of finality, as if it was the last word on the matter. Clara's stomach twisted. She hadn't expected this. It had been her hope that perhaps a more reasonable person might intervene, but now she realized that the very person who had been mocking her was in charge. There was no escape, no higher authority to turn to. She would have to face him alone. Nathaniel's voice dropped even lower, taking on a sharper edge. You know, you're really just a disruption here, a woman of your age. A place like this isn't for you. We cater to people who know how to appreciate the finer things in life. Clara's jaw clenched. The insults were becoming more personal, and the sense of exclusion grew heavier by the second. He had already reduced her to a stereotype, as if she didn't belong in a cafe meant for refined individuals. But Clara refused to let his words shake her. She had fought too hard, lived too long to let someone like him tear her down. I have just as much right to be here as anyone else, she said, her voice low but steady. I am not a troublemaker. I'm simply trying to enjoy my day. Nathaniel's eyes glinted with malice as he stepped even closer. No one here wants to sit near you, he said, his words dripping with venom. You're bad luck, and you should just leave before you cause any more trouble. Clara's blood boiled at the harshness of his words. She had dealt with prejudice her entire life. Her strength had been forged in the fire of these kinds of experiences. But this was different. This wasn't just about race or age. This was about a man attempting to break her spirit. She stood up slowly, eyes locked on his. I'm not going anywhere, Nathaniel. Not until I've finished my tea and I'm ready to leave. But as Clara steadied herself, she could see the gleam in Nathaniel's eyes. He wasn't going to stop here. The look on his face told her everything she needed to know. He intended to escalate this. The tension in the room thickened, and Clara could feel the weight of the other patrons' eyes on her. They had all fallen silent, watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. And then, just as Clara was about to make another attempt to defend herself, something unexpected happened. In the midst of the escalating confrontation, Nathaniel, still glaring at Clara, made a sudden, careless movement. Without warning, he knocked the teapot off the edge of the table. It crashed onto the floor, the scalding water splashing onto Clara's hands, and more crucially, onto the small bottle of medication that she had placed on the table. The burning liquid splattered across her hands and onto her medication bottle, instantly soaking it. Clara gasped, the heat searing through her skin as the bottle shattered, the glass breaking into tiny pieces. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the remains of her vital pills, now rendered useless by the hot water. Her Addison's disease wasn't something she could ignore or take lightly. Without those pills, Clara knew that she would be in serious danger. She could feel her pulse quickening, her body beginning to react to the lack of medication. "No," Clara whispered, her voice shaking as she bent down, trying to salvage what was left of her medication from the wreckage. But it was no use. The pills had melted away into a sticky, unrecognizable mess. The reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. Without her medication, her body would begin to shut down. The exhaustion, dizziness, and nausea would come quickly. She could already feel a wave of weakness creeping over her, but she couldn't let anyone see it. Nathaniel stood there, frozen in place, a look of surprise crossing his face as he realized the extent of the damage. He hadn't meant for this to happen, but that didn't matter to Clara. She couldn't afford to wait for him to apologize. She needed help, and she needed it now. The room felt as though it was spinning around her. The physical pain from the burn on her hands was nothing compared to the overwhelming sense of helplessness that surged through her chest. Without her medication, her Addison's disease could worsen in minutes. But Clara refused to let herself fall apart. She fought to stay upright, gripping the edge of the table as her vision blurred. "I need," she began, but the words caught in her throat as dizziness overcame her. Her legs felt unsteady, and she braced herself, knowing that she had only moments before things could get much worse. She needed to leave, needed to find help. But the strength to move, to think, was slipping away. Clara's vision blurred as her body began to betray her, the symptoms of Addison's disease intensifying with each passing moment. Her hands, still smarting from the hot water, trembled as she fumbled with what remained of her medication. The soft crunch of glass beneath her fingers was a cruel reminder of how dire her situation was. A rising sense of panic gripped her chest as her body struggled to adjust. She had been through this before, but never in a public setting, never with so many eyes on her. It was as though the entire room had become a claustrophobic cage, and Nathaniel's smug face only added to the suffocating feeling that threatened to overwhelm her. She needed to act, and fast. Forcing herself to her feet, Clara reached for her purse. The simple act of standing caused her head to spin violently, and she had to brace herself against the table to stay upright. She could hear the faint buzz of conversation in the cafe, but it seemed distant, muffled, as if she were hearing everything through a thick fog. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the next steps, but everything felt muddled. She knew she couldn't stay here. Leaving without her medication was not an option. It would only make matters worse. But the thought of having to go through this alone, with no one offering even the slightest help, made her feel both helpless and exposed. She tried to steady herself, fighting against the dizziness that threatened to drag her under. The cafe had grown eerily silent, the only sounds now the scraping of silverware and the occasional cough from another table. Clara's gaze swept the room, searching for anyone who might offer assistance, but the patrons seemed to shrink away from her gaze. They didn't look directly at her. They either returned to their own conversations or pretended not to notice the unfolding drama. It was as if they were all complicit in Nathaniel's cruel treatment. Then, without warning, Clara felt a hand on her arm. It was a warm, firm touch, and it jolted her out of her dazed state. She glanced up, startled, and her eyes locked with those of a man who had just entered the cafe. Standing at the door, framed by the late morning sunlight filtering in from outside, was a tall man with a calm and composed demeanor. His features were strong yet approachable, his eyes sharp but kind. Clara recognized him immediately. Marcus King, the famous actor. He was known for his charity work, his outspoken views on social justice, and his advocacy for marginalized communities. Seeing him here, of all places, was both unexpected and oddly reassuring. Marcus had been watching the confrontation quietly from the entrance, taking in the scene with an air of patience. As soon as he saw Clara teetering on the edge of collapse, he made his way toward her, cutting through the tense atmosphere like a breath of fresh air. His presence was commanding, but it also had a gentle, calming effect. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked, his voice low but filled with concern. His hand remained on her arm, steadying her as her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. Clara tried to speak, but her throat felt dry, and the words came out in a raspy whisper. I need my medication," she managed, her voice shaking. She felt so vulnerable in that moment, so exposed in front of everyone, But the pain in her body and the mounting fear for her health left her with no choice but to trust the stranger who had just appeared. Marcus didn't hesitate. His gaze moved from Clara to Nathaniel, his expression hardening. He could see what had happened, the way the cafe manager had treated Clara, the obvious distress she was in. His protective instincts flared to life, but he kept his focus on Clara. "Let's get you out of here," Marcus said gently, his tone reassuring. He placed his other hand on her back, guiding her away from the table. As he helped Clara to her feet, she leaned heavily on him, the world spinning around her. His strength gave her a moment of relief, the first real comfort she had felt since the confrontation began. Nathaniel, seeing Clara leave with Marcus, opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Marcus turned to face him. "You've made your point," Marcus said coolly, his voice firm. "But I think it's time for you to realize just how wrong you are." His eyes flicked briefly to the crowd of patrons who were watching the scene unfold. The room fell into a stunned silence. Marcus led Clara toward the door, his presence providing a shield from the hostility that still lingered in the air. As they exited the cafe, Clara felt a small wave of gratitude wash over her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she had someone by her side, someone who didn't see her as a burden or a disruption. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to lean on another person. Once outside, Clara took in a shaky breath of fresh air. The coolness of the wind on her skin helped clear the fog in her mind, but the toll of what had just happened weighed heavily on her. Her body was still frail, and the dizziness hadn't passed. She needed rest. She needed her medication. Marcus, noticing her struggle, led her toward a nearby car waiting at the curb. The driver, a quiet man in a suit, stood with the door open, ready to assist. Clara was still shaky on her feet, and Marcus's steady hand guided her into the vehicle. Once inside, the door clicked shut behind them, and the tension that had followed Clara since she entered the cafe began to melt away, if only slightly. As the car pulled away from the cafe, Marcus gave Clara a reassuring smile, though there was an unmistakable glint of concern in his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, speaking in a soft tone. "You're safe now," he said, his voice comforting, yet determined. "That place, you don't need to worry about it anymore. What happened there isn't your fault." Clara nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The relief was almost too much to bear. She had been on the edge, her body and mind at their breaking points, and now she was being pulled away from that place, that humiliation, by someone who genuinely cared. "I don't know how to thank you," Clara whispered, her voice shaky but sincere. "You didn't have to do that. You don't even know me." Marcus's expression softened. "I don't need to know you to know that what happened was wrong. No one should be treated that way. And as for helping you, well, it's what anyone would do, right?" Clara shook her head slightly, still trying to process the kindness in his voice. "Not everyone would. Not like this." Marcus gave a small, humble smile. "Maybe not. But I'm glad I could be here. I'm glad you didn't have to face that alone." They drove in silence for a few moments, the noise of the city fading as they put distance between them and the scene at the cafe. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, leaning her head back against the seat. She felt both exhausted and strangely comforted. She knew there was more to her story that needed to be written, more to the healing that still had to come. But for now, at least she wasn't alone. As Marcus's car navigated through the bustling streets of the city, Clara could feel herself slowly regaining control of her body. The initial shock of what had happened at the cafe was beginning to wear off, though the emotional toll still lingered heavily in her chest. She glanced out of the window, watching the city pass by, feeling the tension that had gripped her slowly begin to ebb away. But Marcus wasn't going to let the incident fade into the background. He had seen the cruelty that Clara had endured, and he wasn't going to let it be ignored. Not now, and not ever. His fingers hovered over his phone, but it was clear from the way he focused on it that this wasn't just a casual act. This was intentional. "Don't worry, Clara," Marcus said, his tone soft but purposeful. "I'm going to make sure this gets the attention it deserves. No one gets away with treating people like that. Not while I can help it." Clara met his gaze, her lips parting slightly in surprise. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice still shaky from the emotional whirlwind she had just experienced. I'm going to document what happened. I'm going to show the world what kind of person Nathaniel really is. And I'll make sure that Café knows exactly who they're dealing with, Marcus explained, his expression resolute. Clara hesitated. She wasn't sure how she felt about making such a public spectacle of what had just happened. The thought of thousands, or even millions of people seeing her humiliation in a viral video made her stomach turn. But at the same time, she knew it had to be done. The injustice she had faced couldn't just be swept under the rug. Marcus's fingers began to type rapidly as he launched a live stream. Clara watched as he subtly angled the camera toward her, showing the back of the cafe in the frame. His actions were measured, not wanting to make Clara feel uncomfortable, but ensuring that the focus would be on the cafe and its manager, Nathaniel. As the live stream began, Marcus spoke directly into the camera, his voice calm but firm. "Hello, everyone," he said, his words smooth, yet carrying the weight of his purpose. "What I'm about to show you isn't just a story about one woman's experience. This is a story about discrimination, about ignorance, and about how we, as a society, can no longer tolerate this behavior." He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room of the cafe in the background, his gaze lingering on Nathaniel, who had finally realized what was happening. The cafe manager, once so confident in his cruelty, now seemed uneasy, realizing that the attention was about to shift from Clara's supposed disruption to his own deplorable actions. "Watch closely," Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. "What you'll see here is a woman, a kind, hard-working woman, who was subjected to abuse and humiliation simply because of the color of her skin and her age. And it wasn't enough that the staff was rude. This manager, Nathaniel, actually went so far as to spill scalding water on her medication. He tried to destroy her right to be here." As Marcus spoke, the camera panned toward the remnants of the spilled water on the cafe floor, then toward Clara, who had been patiently enduring the chaos, her hand still gripping her purse tightly. Marcus made sure to include everything. The cold treatment, the forced confrontation, the way Nathaniel had mocked Clara's medical needs. And he did it all while Clara sat there, steady but determined, refusing to let herself be broken. The comment section began to fill rapidly with people expressing their shock, anger, and disbelief. Some even recognized Marcus and took to the chat to voice their support. Within minutes, the video had gone viral, spreading like wildfire across social media. Clara watched as the notifications and messages flooded in, feeling a strange mix of relief and trepidation. She wasn't sure what to expect from the flood of attention, but she knew one thing for sure. What had happened to her would not go unnoticed. And it wasn't just the internet buzzing. Within an hour, news vans began arriving at the cafe, reporters holding microphones and cameras ready to get the scoop. The cafe, which had once been so calm and serene, was now engulfed in chaos. People crowded the entrance, some demanding answers from the staff, others simply standing in solidarity with Clara. The once quiet establishment had turned into a battleground for justice, and Nathaniel's smug demeanor had quickly evaporated, replaced by visible discomfort. The cafe's owner, who had clearly been alerted to the unfolding situation, arrived shortly afterward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He approached the door, trying to assess the situation, but the growing crowd made it impossible for him to enter. Inside, a sense of accountability had begun to settle in, as people realized they could no longer pretend the injustice was not happening. Marcus, still recording, turned to Clara with a nod of approval. "This is how we make things right," he said quietly, so only she could hear, "by making sure the truth is known." As the scene at the cafe grew more chaotic, Marcus helped Clara into the car once again. The driver, still as quiet and composed as ever, gave them both a nod before pulling out into the traffic. Clara couldn't help but glance over her shoulder as the cafe and the swarming reporters began to fade into the distance. It was hard to believe what had just transpired, but a part of her felt vindicated. The world was starting to know what she had gone through, and there was no way it could be brushed aside anymore. The car sped through the streets, taking Clara further away from the scene, the constant sound of sirens in the background as the media frenzy intensified. But in the calm of the car, Clara found some measure of peace. Her body was still weak, but her mind was slowly clearing. "Thank you," she whispered to Marcus, her voice soft with gratitude. I don't know how to repay you for what you did. I didn't ask for any of this. Marcus shook his head, his expression warm. You don't need to repay me, Clara. You just need to take care of yourself. You've been through enough today. Clara smiled faintly, feeling the strain of the day slowly lifting. I never expected any of this. I thought I would just go in for a quiet moment, and then this. Marcus laughed softly. I can imagine, but you're tougher than you think. You didn't back down when that guy tried to tear you apart. You stood your ground, even when it seemed like the whole world was against you. She looked out the window for a moment, reflecting on his words. She had stood her ground, hadn't she? She had fought through the humiliation, the fear, and the pain, and she had come out the other side. She wasn't broken. Not yet. And now, thanks to Marcus, she wouldn't have to face this battle alone. As they continued to drive through the city, the noise of the world around them began to fade. For the first time in hours, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. Her body was still hurting, and her mind was tired, but she wasn't alone. She had a voice now, and that voice was being heard. Marcus's words echoed in her mind. This is how we make things right. Clara couldn't help but smile, knowing that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The car ride felt longer than it actually was, as Clara tried to steady her breath and make sense of everything that had just happened. Marcus, sensing her need for some space, didn't press her for conversation, but his calming presence kept her grounded. The chaos and distress from the cafe had faded into the background, but Clara's mind was still racing. She felt a storm of emotions, the anger at Nathaniel's treatment, the pain of her own vulnerability, and the overwhelming relief that someone had stepped in to help when she needed it the most. Eventually, Clara turned to Marcus, who was driving with an unwavering focus, his hands gripping the wheel with casual confidence. There was something about the way he carried himself, something steady and strong, that made Clara feel like she wasn't as alone as she had felt moments before. Marcus, she began, her voice quieter now but filled with a new curiosity. Why did you do it? I mean, I didn't ask for any help. I didn't expect this. Marcus glanced over at her briefly, his lips curling into a small, reassuring smile. You didn't have to ask, he said, his voice calm but firm. What happened to you today? It wasn't right, and someone had to stand up for you. I just happened to be the one who was there. But honestly, Clara, I've seen too many people go through things like this in silence, and that's not something I can stand by and watch. Clara nodded slowly, his words sinking in as they traveled through the city streets. I know. It's just, I wasn't prepared for what happened. I didn't even know that kind of hate could be so blatant. I've faced it in different forms throughout my life, but it's never been like that. It was so personal, so cruel. Marcus's grip tightened on the wheel as he turned onto a quieter road, the city's noise gradually fading away. People can be awful, but what happened today doesn't define you. You're strong, Clara. I can see it. You stood up for yourself, even when that guy tried to break you down. A lot of people would have just left or taken the abuse, but you didn't. Clara glanced out the window, watching the passing buildings blur by. She had been strong. She knew that. But she hadn't felt that strength at the time. She had felt small, invisible, like she didn't matter in that moment. I don't feel strong, Marcus. I felt helpless. And now all I can think about is the things he said, the way he treated me. Those words don't define who you are, Clara. They only define him. The way he treated you was about him, not you. You're better than that, and you don't have to carry his cruelty with you. Clara allowed herself a small smile at his words, feeling a little lighter despite herself. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them, how much she had needed someone to tell her that her worth was not bound by the actions of others. I don't know how to explain it. Clara continued, her voice softer now, but everything just seemed to hit me at once. My health, the discrimination, it all felt like too much. And for a second, I just didn't know what to do. Marcus glanced at her with understanding, his tone gentle. I get it. I really do. Life's not easy, especially when it feels like the world's working against you. But you're not alone. You've got people who care. And now you've got me in your corner, too. Clara nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone to say that, to remind her that she wasn't as isolated as she sometimes felt. I didn't expect this, Clara said after a pause, her voice thoughtful. But I'm glad you were there. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. Marcus smiled, his eyes still on the road. I think you would have found your strength. You're not the type to back down. But I'm glad I was there to help. Just the same. The car continued its journey, the two of them sharing a moment of understanding. As the conversation turned quieter, a peaceful silence settled between them. Clara's thoughts drifted to her condition, the constant management of Addison's disease, and how exhausting it could be to keep up with the physical and emotional weight of it all. But with Marcus's words still echoing in her mind, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a glimmer of hope, a sense that things could change. By the time they reached Clara's apartment, the events of the day had settled into something more manageable, though still heavy on her mind. Marcus pulled into the parking lot and parked the car, turning off the engine and looking over at Clara. She was still shaken, but there was a newfound strength in her gaze, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there earlier. Thank you, Marcus, she said, her voice sincere. I don't know how to explain what today means to me. You really came through when I needed someone. He gave a nod of acknowledgement. It's what anyone would have done. Just glad I was the one who could be there for you. You don't have to go through this alone. Clara's eyes softened as she thought about what he had done for her, how he had shown up when she felt like the world was against her. It wasn't just that he had helped in the moment. It was the way he had treated her with respect, with dignity, when others hadn't. He had seen her as a person, not just as a target. As they walked toward her door, Clara noticed her grandson Isaiah standing in the hallway, a curious expression on his face. His eyes widened when he saw Marcus, but before he could say anything, Clara stepped forward and hugged him tightly. Grandma, what happened? I was so worried. Isaiah's voice was filled with concern as he clung to her, his young face full of emotion. I saw the video. Are you okay? Clara smiled at her grandson, her heart swelling with pride. Isaiah had always been her rock, the one constant in her life that made everything feel worth it. He was strong, brave, and smart, and he was learning from her every day how to stand up for what was right. I'm okay, Isaiah, Clara said softly, squeezing him. I'm okay, thanks to Marcus here. Isaiah turned to Marcus, who was standing by the door with a quiet smile. Marcus, right? He asked, his tone respectful. I saw what you did. That was incredible. Thank you for helping my grandma. Marcus nodded, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. No problem. It's the least I could do. Your grandmother is one of the strongest people I know. Clara beamed at the exchange, a feeling of warmth and gratitude welling up inside her. It wasn't just the fact that she had survived the day. It was that her family was there for her, and she had found someone who respected her strength. She had faced something that felt impossible, but in the end, she had come through stronger, with new connections that she hadn't anticipated. As they sat down in her living room, Clara reflected on the day's events. The media coverage had ensured that Nathaniel's actions were known to the public, and the cafe was facing serious backlash. But it wasn't just about the publicity. It was about the impact, about the fact that someone had been willing to stand up and make a difference. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she was not just surviving, but thriving. She had faced adversity head-on, and had found not only the strength within herself, but the support of those around her. This is just the beginning, Isaiah, Clara said, looking at her grandson and then at Marcus. We've got so much more to do, and we'll do it together. As the evening settled in, with the sound of distant sirens outside and a quiet calm within, Clara knew one thing for sure. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she was no longer facing them alone. Her story was far from over. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where justice, compassion, and the power of standing together would shape the future. The following days after the incident at the cafe felt like a turning point for Clara. She was no longer defined by the harshness of that moment or the cruelty she had faced. Instead, she found herself empowered by the overwhelming support that poured in from all corners. News outlets picked up the story of the confrontation, but what stood out in the media coverage wasn't just the injustice she'd suffered. It was the dignity with which she had responded to it, the quiet strength that had propelled her through the storm. What had started as a personal battle against one man's cruelty had become a public statement about standing up to discrimination, about claiming one's space in a world that often seemed to forget people like Clara, people who had spent a lifetime fighting not just for equality, but for the simple right to exist without fear or prejudice. And the more Clara reflected on it, the more she realized that her story had become something greater than her own. But the true turning point wasn't the media attention or even the viral video. It wasn't the backlash that Nathaniel faced or the support from the people who'd watched the footage unfold. It was in the quiet moments when Clara sat with her family, when she talked with Isaiah, or when she shared a cup of tea with Marcus, that the full weight of what had happened hit her. It wasn't just that she had won this one battle. She had taken back something she had almost forgotten she could ever have again. She had reclaimed her voice. For so long, Clara had felt like a passive observer in her own life, as if the world was a stage she didn't have permission to perform on. The years of dealing with her health, her struggle with Addison's disease, and the constant pressure to prove her worth to those around her had left her feeling like an outsider in her own story. But today, that had changed. Today, Clara had taken control of her narrative. She had stood firm, not just as a survivor, but as a woman who could face adversity head-on and refuse to back down, no matter the cost. It was a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life. That dignity in the face of hardship, standing tall against injustice, and showing up for yourself, even when the world doesn't show up for you, are acts of power that no one can take away. And through it all, Clara had found not just the courage to keep going, but the realization that she didn't have to fight these battles alone. Sitting on her couch with Isaiah beside her, Clara took a deep breath. The world outside still buzzed with the aftermath of the incident, but in her home, there was peace. There was a sense of quiet victory. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but it was real. She had weathered the storm, and though there were still challenges ahead, Clara was no longer afraid of them. She knew she was capable of handling whatever came next. Because now, more than ever, she knew who she was. Marcus had become a steady friend, someone she knew she could trust, someone who had seen her not just for the challenges she faced, but for her strength, her resilience, and the quiet wisdom that had carried her through so much. And she had been reminded of just how important those relationships were, the ones built not on expectation or convenience, but on genuine respect and understanding. In a world that often felt like it was set against people like her, it was these bonds that would carry her forward. As the days stretched into weeks, Clara continued to use her newfound voice to advocate for others. She became involved in local campaigns against discrimination, volunteering her time to speak at events and share her story with others who might need to hear it. The platform she had been given, the audience that had witnessed her stand up to injustice, became an opportunity for change. Clara knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Her journey had opened up doors, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced, overlooked, or unheard. Isaiah, too, began to see his grandmother in a new light. He had always admired her, but now he understood her in a deeper, more profound way. Her strength, her resolve, her ability to rise above the challenges she faced, it all made sense to him now. And as he grew, as he learned to navigate the world with his own sense of justice and compassion, he carried the lessons she had taught him. Lessons of kindness, of fighting for what is right, and of never backing down from adversity. In the end, Clara realized that the pain she had experienced wasn't in vain. It had been a catalyst, a push forward that had propelled her into a new chapter of her life. And though the world was far from perfect, she knew that she had the power to make it a little bit better, one step at a time. Her legacy, she realized, wasn't just in what she had endured, but in the way she had chosen to rise, each time stronger, more confident, and more determined to make a difference. As the years passed, Clara continued to be an inspiration, not just to Isaiah, but to everyone who encountered her. She had become a symbol of quiet revolution, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit can rise, unbroken. And as she looked at the life unfolding before her, Clara knew that her story, her fight, was far from over. It was a story that would continue to echo in the lives of those she had touched, a legacy of love, courage, and unwavering belief in the power of standing up for what is right. This, Clara realized, was her true victory, and it was one that no one could ever take from her. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this entire journey, for listening to Clara's story, and for witnessing the powerful moments that unfolded. I truly appreciate each of you who took the time to watch this video and engage with the narrative. If you found something meaningful in Clara's journey, whether it's the strength in adversity, the importance of standing up for yourself, or the power of kindness and empathy, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Your support means the world, and it helps spread these important messages to others who may need to hear them. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. We've got a lot more coming your way, and I wouldn't want you to miss out on the next chapter. Thank you again for being part of this experience. Keep standing strong, keep fighting for what's right, and remember, your story matters. Until next time.